So we're going to be taking a look at turning points within this particular lecture. And big turning point is enlisting the help of France to try and defeat the British. So begs the question, why did France help us out? Now, the Battle of Saratoga is actually a series of two battles that took place in upstate New York, fall of 1777. The Americans are led by Horatio Gates, and this guy is still attempting to undermine Washington and assume command of the Continental Army. To aid him in fighting John Burgoyne's British troops, who were marching south from Canada, Washington sent General Benedict Arnold, and it was said that Arnold fought inspired by the fury of a demon. Washington also sent 500 sharpshooters who spent a good portion of their service picking off British soldiers, and officers, and getting the officers, it's still a little bit frowned upon. Arnold was viewed as primarily responsible for the victory, and you can even see on the map that Arnold is commanding the troops in actual combat, whereas Gates is with the reserves from the relative safety of Bemis Heights. Gates ended up taking the credit for the win, and Arnold's very bitter, and he even sustained a musket ball through one of his legs, resulting in a peg leg for the rest of his life. Now, his lack of recognition, the fact that he wasn't promoted as fast as he desired, and the prodding of the woman that he would marry, who sympathized with the British, led him to defect to the British side. He was placed in charge of Fort Arnold, which is now West Point, and had conspired to hand it over to the British. Now, this plot was foiled at the last minute, but the aftermath of Saratoga, that's going to be where he begins to kind of stew a little bit. And as a side note, we have 11 Oneida serving as officers in the Revolution, and we even have a woman, Dolly Cobus, who took the place of her husband at Saratoga when he was injured. So we got a lot happening in upstate New York in fall 1777. Now, apparently King George III fell into agonies when he heard of the surrender. That's the phrase people use, fell into agonies. And the opposition party in Parliament began to publicly resist spending money and troops on a faraway war that seemed harder and harder to win. Now, in early December of 1777, a rider approached Ben Franklin in Paris, where he was trying to enlist French support. We see him there in that fur hat. He wore that, obviously, for public relations. He's a city guy, born in Boston, lived his adult life in Philadelphia, but people think here's this rough, rugged American and backwoods. Franklin wanted to play the part. A rider approaches him, and Franklin sighs and says, "Sir, is Philadelphia taken?" The rider replied, "Yes, sir, but General Burgoyne and his entire army are prisoners of war." Franklin used this to elicit French support for the war effort. Now, the first French fleet arrived in July of 1778 with a total of 16 ships, carrying 4,000 soldiers. And this is where we're going to start to see the war become more global, since most of the French fleet remained in the West Indies, hindering joint operations with the Americans. Now, the alliance itself is a bit troublesome. And from the start, you see the French outfitted in their fancy white uniforms, and they're shocked at the raggedy dress of the Continental Army. The French thought Washington was in command of more men than he was, and Washington was keenly aware of the fact that the French were mainly looking to damage and embarrass Britain, not to specifically help the Americans. John Adams said that the French foreign minister kept his hand under our chin to prevent us from drowning, but not to lift our heads out of water. Now, nevertheless, this is a big-time turning point, getting the help of the French. So we've got a pretty significant victory. And the succeeding winter, also going to be a turning point of sorts, but it's going to be a little bit rougher. Now, Valley Forge. It's a rural village in southeast Pennsylvania. It's about 20 miles from Philadelphia. It's got about 50 residents per square mile, and it produced a lot of crops, which is why the area was selected, so it's pretty rich in farmland. Unfortunately, the British occupied Philadelphia, and they had scoured the surrounding countryside already for available crops. Now, why was there such a struggle this winter? The soldiers were made up of the poorest members of society, because all of the more well-off or property-owning citizens are in the militia, where they could come and go as they please. So, they're already struggling in life. The quartermaster, there wasn't food because the person in charge of supplies for the military had resigned, and the initial replacement was woefully inadequate. And not only could they not get supplies, but continental currency was worthless, so local suppliers are more likely to sell to the British. And quite frankly, this war is already going on much longer than anyone expected. So, with a winter like this, it's kind of a misnomer that it was brutally cold. It was cold, but, no worse than normal. So why does it matter? Well, Valley Forge is when changes were made that influenced the remainder of the war. Baron von Steuben drilled the troops to turn them into more of an effective military fighting force. To temporarily solve the food issue, the Oneidas of the Haudenosaunee helped the Continental Army. Now, the woman you see on screen, and you can even see Washington in the background, her name's Polly Cooper, and she was the only Oneida woman to make the 250-mile journey, and she arrived with hundreds of bushels of corn. Now, she shelled the corn and prepped it into a soup. And there were also Oneida warriors who served in a battle immediately following that winter at Valley Forge, so we get the assistance of the Oneidas. And Valley Forge also illustrated the role of women in the war as the wives of officers. Like you see Martha Washington and Lucy Knox. They accompany the army at winter camp to support the war effort. Now finally, Washington, he's going to be convinced to implement a defensive strategy to attempt to reconcile the lack of troops that he's got. The resolve of the army and its officers are also going to be hardened. Now, in the opinion of many of these officers, the serious problems that they face stemmed from a lack of a strong national government. It's no accident that the primary proponents of a strong federal government, like Washington and Alexander Hamilton, Henry Knox, James Marshall, John Marshall, I should say, they're present together at Valley Forge. All right, so we have Saratoga, that elicits French aid. It's going to be followed up by the winter at Valley Forge. Now with that, what about those nations along the frontier? Now fighting in pitched battles, along with guerrilla warfare, that's part of the Southern strategy, they get the most attention related to the Revolution. And we just saw, Saratoga and the invasion of New York also gets a lot of press in terms of New York's role. But when you look at the frontier, if you look at this map, we got New York City, where I'm pointing with the arrow, but then Fort Albany, modern-day city of Albany, Fort Stanwix. These are upstate New York. It's a little bit more rural. There's some intense fighting that goes on here, and it illustrates the complex role played by the indigenous tribes during the Revolution. Now, the Haudenosaunee supported the British at the end of the French and Indian War. So the British attempted to gain their support during this conflict, but the Americans did as well. The guy you see on screen, Mohawk Joseph Brant, prime example of this dynamic. He befriended Britain's superintendent of Indian Affairs prior to the beginning of the war, and the death of this man eventually pushed him to the British side. Most leaders saw this as a conflict between the Americans and the British, and they really wanted no part of it. But Brant actually traveled to Canada for safety when it was believed that Patriot forces would invade. He shortly thereafter went to Canada, and then he would, gain an audience with King George III after he went from Canada to England, returning in time for the invasion of New York. So he'd participate in this. He would lead a unit that was nicknamed Brant's Volunteers and would ultimately fight against the Americans. His legend grew to the point where he was blamed for any attack that involved indigenous fighters, even taking full blame for what became known as the Cherry Valley Massacre, even though reports indicate he attempted to save women and children. Now, this is just one example. There were some nations like the Oneida and Tuscarora who allied with the Americans, and they got okay treatment after the war. Okay is the best way we can put it. Many cast their lot with the British because they felt that their post-war prospects would be better off. General Washington was incensed with what was happening along New York's frontier, and he ordered the destruction of several Onondaga towns that were believed to have aided British sympathizing indigenous fighters. Most would find themselves out of luck after the war no matter who they supported. Now, Brant spent the rest of his war attacking Oneida settlements and attempting to gather allies west of the British fort of Detroit. The end of the war is going to come as a complete shock to Brant and indigenous fighters as a whole. Now, his reputation is going to recover upon closer examination, and he's going to continue to advocate for indigenous rights after the establishment of the United States. So, the role of indigenous nations, a little bit more complex than just saying they supported the Brits or the Americans.